So our guest today is Amos Fox, Dr. Amos Fox, who is a fellow with Arizona State University's Future Security Initiative. Amos is also a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston, and he, of course, famously hosts the Revolution and Military Affairs podcast, the Soldier Pulse and Warcast podcasts as well, and he also serves as an editorial board member with the Journal of Military Studies. And Amos is also a retired U.S. Army officer, where he served more than 24 years, retiring at the rank of lieutenant colonel. So Amos, thank you very much again for giving us some of your precious time. Good morning to Texas then.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Always happy to chat with you. I enjoy the conversation every time we get to talk. So looking forward to where we go today.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just a little bit context about what we are doing. Actually, I'm here the Director General of the Hungarian Defense Research and Innovation Agency. This is abbreviated as VIKI, which is always very funny because my wife is also called Vicky. So we have some troubles around it.
I bet she doesn't let you call her the director, though, huh?
But, you know, I always sound credible when I say Vicky is very important for me. And my hobby is my career as well. But putting jokes aside, Vicky is tasked by the Ministry of Defense, and it is also financed to do so, to enhance the overall defense innovation ecosystem in Hungary and also expand its relations beyond the country's border, of course, with a focus to NATO science and technology community and the European defense industrial base and the related community. VIKI is conducting defense research, super interesting. We are doing some machine learning enabled data analysis. Actually, currently the team is invested with casualty analysis from the Russo-Ukraine war. We also have a larger team which is dealing with research, development, and innovation. They are primarily focused on what else? Drone warfare and autonomous systems. What is super interesting is actually looking to the impact of these systems to force development and actually understanding human-machine teaming, not as a technological problem, but more of a cultural, organizational, doctrinal problem. So this is why we try to take these issues as systems, and we are looking for systemic level solutions, working together with the Hungarian Defense Forces, of course, and other allied and research development initiatives. Beyond that, of course, we also have an increasing strategic outreach, strategic relations and strategic communication. And we have this really humble effort, at least it has been humble so far before you came in and joined us for this conversation, to actually talk about future wars, and through talking about this topic, of course, highlighting major challenges, but also opportunities for the defense sector, all actors within the defense sector, focusing on the small, medium enterprises who are often actually struggling to understand the entire picture, the entire context. There are a lot of conversations around, but it takes significant resources to actually attend these conversations. So with our own humble ways, we are trying to enhance this conversation within the country, bring bright people into the conversation. And once again, thank you very much for joining us. In this context, actually, the first discussion I would like to open with you could be nothing else than talking about the revolution in military affairs, the name of your podcast. And of course, I have read your early articles in 2016. I also think that actually your articles have contributed greatly to the conversation about the balance of maneuver and fire. And somehow, for me, the culmination point of that scientific but also very practical conversation was with the article of General Zaluzhny in The Economist. At the same time, of course, we have to point out that there are striking overlaps with your own ideas. So, of course, you have seen the evolution, your ideas in many ways. Please tell me a little bit about kind of how you would approach maneuvers and fires, its balance, and how it has actually changed since you established your initial ideas based on your observations.
So I think the starting point is, for me, I was an armor officer, and you're indoctrinated in the U.S. Army to think in terms of maneuver. I'm going to borrow a German phrase and totally mispronounce it, but maneuver über alles, right? Maneuver is the best thing in the world. That's all we do. And you still hear General Rainey, the commander of Army Futures Command, say that all the time, right? The U.S. Army does maneuver. And so as a tank company commander at the National Training Center, we went out. I was there when we started redoing the decisive action rotations, whatever they're called now. The name's changed, but force on force fighting, having gotten away from we transitioned from the OIF and OEF, the Afghanistan and Iraq-based scenarios, and we went back to tanks fighting, in the desert. And that's, I'm paraphrasing how that's all, outlined there. But as part of that, I had done really well fighting in the box, leading my tank company as part of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. And, I was having a chat with my squadron executive officer at the time, and I was explaining my thought process about how I was seeing things on the battlefield. And to me, it was all based off time and doing time distance analysis in my head, figure out where to get my people in place based off the way the terrain was, because we had a bit more familiarity with the terrain, and we'd gone out and done all this time distance analysis stuff ahead of time. So we had a general appreciation for how long it would take to move from position 1 to position 2. And I was explaining my thought process after this rotation. And my squadron XO, my squadron executive officer, was like, hey, he went to SAS, which is the Air Force version of SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies. And he was like, hey, what you're talking about sounds like this book that we had to read in SAS called Fighting by Minutes by Robert Leonard. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. I like books. And so I went and picked this book up, and this is 2013, 2014. And that basically got me started on this path to trying to understand maneuver warfare inside and out as best as I possibly could, from the theoretical foundation all the way to the applied, application of the concept. And at the time, I was a huge believer in it. I was like, yeah, this is great. This is the best thing ever. Why isn't everybody doing this? And then I went and I basically became an atheist through my process of examination on the concept, right? Because as I found over the course of time that, the idea itself is built on very shaky theoretical evidence, and a lot of it is, the stuff that we use today, Western militaries in particular use today to underpin the ideas behind maneuver, is written on just complete, nonsense most of the time. If you go back and look at William Lynn's Maneuver Warfare Handbook that was published in the early 80s from Marine Corps, it's like a total, hat tip to the Germans in the Second World War. A lot of it's just not supported whatsoever with any kind of evidence, and it's just one dude's opinion about how to do things, right? And then that book's actually the foundation for a lot of what people, now point to as like, hey, this is the way we should do maneuver. This is why we should do maneuver. Richard Simpkins' Race to the Swift book, very similar, just based on utter nonsense. It's got straw man logic that tries to attack attrition and attritional warfare, and it doesn't actually lay a foundation for what is attrition, other than these things that I say are bad, and then what is maneuver, which are all these good things, right? And there's a lot of stuff that gets equated to maneuver, like, oh, it's about surprise and achieving, this cognitive overmatch and overwhelming your opponent. That applies to anything, you know what I mean? Any way that you go out to fight somebody, you're always trying to surprise them, right? And then there's another, one of the common things, and when I worked, my last assignment in the Army was at Army Futures Command, and one of the things that we always heard the generals say when we talk about this, what is, attrition and maneuver? What are we doing? Right. And they're like, well, attrition's about 1-for-1 exchange ratios. I'm like, what world do you live in where that's actually something somebody's going out and trying to do? And again, if you go back and read anything on any of these concepts, like that's, guys like Lind, guys like Simkin, Lutwak, Edward Lutwak even, has a lot of this nonsense in his book Strategy, which is the baseline for a lot of maneuver thinking that exists today and that emerged in the 90s. And it's, it's tied to stuff like that, these completely illogical and unfounded ideas, right? And so, as I went through and started trying to understand the concept, that was really for me eye-opening, because I was like, I kind of feel like I'm being lied to about this whole thing, right? And the more that I did research on it, the more that I found that really it's all just opinion based for the most part. Which way of fighting do you prefer? And then neither one of them are really, there's no real like science behind any of it, and so to me that opened up the aperture a bit, and I was like, okay, well, then I can contribute to the lack of science and try and put a little bit of rigor behind what people are saying. And so that, really got me going down this path of I'm going to start developing these ideas with a little bit more, theoretical underpinning and theories behind them. So like right now, I actually have a paper with Rusi. I just sent it back after getting the peer reviews. I sent it back a couple days ago, and it's called Theory of Attrition, and it's making an actual theory of attrition warfare, because everybody talks about attrition. I've written a bunch about attrition, so much so that people have called me an attritionist, which actually irritates me because I'm not advocating for attrition. I'm saying it's a thing that exists that has to be done. You can say reality is reality and still not be for something, right? And so that paper will be coming out, I don't know, I think sometime before the end of the year at Rusi Journal. And I also have a book based off all this research called Maneuvers Dead. I just got that back on Monday from the publisher Bloomsbury. And I've got to do the, work, the edits from the peer review on that and get that back here in the next couple of months. And so I'm excited that'll be out next year. And that really dives into, so the article that I mentioned with Rusi that's coming out, that's actually a chapter from the book that I modified for publication. There's another 2 chapters from the book that I'm publishing also as papers. But that's to take this theoretical gap that exists and push it out and like here's a far more, peer-reviewed, developed book that hopefully people can point to. And I named it Maneuvers Dead partially to just get people riled up. I don't think maneuver doesn't exist. I don't think it's not a thing. I think it exists on very small portions of the battlefield, and this is part of the problem that people have, saying we only do maneuver. No, man, the battlefield says you do positional warfare or attritional warfare sometimes. And the problem that one of my big problems with this whole conversation is the fact that, the U.S. in particular, but I think really just almost everybody, they don't actually discuss in their doctrine what positional warfare is. You mentioned Zaluzhny, he talks about it. They don't talk about attritional warfare. And then we always find ourselves in these fights, or urban warfare for that matter. Urban warfare has gotten hot like the past 10 years, but before that it didn't exist because we wanted to deny that it was a thing. And it's the same thing like positional and attritional warfare. We're denying its agency over the battlefield and its actual, significant role that it plays in warfare, because we just don't like it, right? And I think that that's really bad because it underprepares the people that will then find themselves fighting positionally, fighting attritionally, fighting in urban environments, doing counterinsurgency, right? We had this huge gap in counterinsurgency within doctrine, and then we found ourselves fighting a counterinsurgency. I was part of that in 2005, 2006. I was in Iraq as a lieutenant. Everything's burning to the ground. That was the worst time of the war. If you go back and look at anything that's been written lately, they always talk about that period of time being the worst time of the war. And we were there
that was before the Anbar awakening, the turning point.
Yeah, and we were there. Yep, and we were there driving around, getting blown up every day. Like, what are we doing here? What are we supposed to be doing, right? And so you showed up unprepared because institutions just refuse to accept the realities that you would encounter. And so when I was in the Army, that was always my big driving force is like, what are we not talking about that we should be talking about that needs illuminated, and how can I help illuminate that, right? And so that's really like my impetus for all of that was based off that rotation at the National Training Center, my squadron executive officer mentioning Robert Leonard's Fighting by Minutes book, and then my own interest in like understanding things and then trying to help fix problems. The irony of that is that earned me a lot of enemies when I was in the Army, and even now there's a lot of people that don't like me, the stuff that I publish, because they feel that it goes against the institution. I'm not going against the institution. I'm trying to help the institution. Even now, the stuff that I'm working on, it's to help us, the collective us, understand how wars are actually fought, right? And so, that was the basis for all that. I published an article with Armor Magazine back in 2017 while I was in SAMS. I wrote it. And this is when I was like, hey, we don't talk about positional warfare, and we don't really talk about attritional warfare. We just, relegate attritional warfare to something bad, something stupid, something that poor militaries do. And maneuver is the great thing that we do. And everybody else that isn't us does attrition because they're dumb and not as good as us, right? And then positional warfare is not even mentioned anywhere, right? And to be frank, like when I was working on my book, Maneuver is Dead, there's a chapter on positional warfare. I develop and write a theory of positional warfare. It was so hard putting that chapter together because nothing exists on positional warfare. You can see it mentioned like periodically in places. I had to go back to like Tony King at now the University of Exeter. I was like, hey, Tony, I need some help. You got any ideas on where I can find this? And he gave me a book on Marlborough, the campaigns of Marlborough, from whatever year that was, written by David Chandler, the big Napoleonic historian. So I bought that book, and there's like a couple paragraphs in that book that talks about it just briefly. And then there's some stuff, again, I mentioned Simpkin a little bit ago. He, again, equates positional warfare to attrition. He says it's the same thing. And I was like, that's actually incorrect, and this is part of the reason, like, a lot of maneuver fans are like, have you read Simpkin's Race to the Swift? It's so good. And I'm like, have you read Simpkin's Race to the Swift? It's nonsense, right? And so, like that, I took that book and I was like, okay, I read it and I was like, this is not right. And so, I use that in the book as I'm explaining positional warfare, and I frame it out and, help use that to develop the theory and the ideas in that chapter within the book. And so positional warfare, I think you can't look at it, these two, maneuver and attrition, without talking about positional warfare, because I think it's really, to be honest, and I've written this before, I think maneuver is actually a subset of positional warfare if we're thinking big picture and how to like bucket ideas. But I found that if you say that, people just look at you with like glazed eyes and they're like, what? And so I've in my other book, Conflict Realism, I have that in there, and I have it framed that way in a couple of other things. But I found that it's almost too challenging because people are so unfamiliar with positional warfare that they can't make that gap or that leap in terms of understanding things. And so I've moved from that and just kept it separate and talk about it that way. But the idea really, like when you think about maneuver requires several conditions and situations for it to be something that can be done, right? You need space. You have to have space to move, because maneuver, the whole idea is underpinned on the ability to move freely, relatively speaking, right? And then a lot of the other ideas, right? Like the maneuverist approach. If you read, British Army doctrine, it's all about the maneuverist approach. Like, those are just ideas about how to think about fighting that apply to anything, right? We're going to try and generate surprise. We're going to use mission command and power down decision making. We're going to, try and strike not the strong points, but the weak points. And I think that idea itself is, okay, that's a general idea. But at the same time, sometimes it's better to, it's situationally dependent. Sometimes you may need to attack the strong point, right? And so there's a lot of ideas that underpin the whole concept that are just applicable to everything and or just silly in general, right? And so, there's maneuver, but it also exists if you think, like, again, as an American who, was in the U.S. Army, we're fundamentally expeditionary. We're always going from somewhere to something to do the fighting, right? And so we're always going to be closing the distance. But at a certain point, the distance between you and whatever your objective is there's like no gap, right? You've closed the distance, and then you're in the close combat phase of things. And essentially, once you've closed that gap, like the opportunities for maneuver cease, right? And then you're fighting positionally. You're fighting from one position to another, or trying to lure people out of positions through the use of, localized movement or different things like that. Or you're just fighting attritionally. You're just trying to outkill the opponent on the other side of the line. That doesn't mean you're standing up and say, "Hey, here I am, shoot me," while you're shooting at them, right? And so there's clearly, and Mike Kaufman talks about this a lot too. There's a maneuver phase, a maneuver period, a maneuver portion of the box that maneuver exists in, but then it gradually fades into positional warfare, and there's a small band, if you're thinking of it in terms of a box, where positional warfare is the predominant thing. And then as you fully close with the adversary, it transitions to essentially a positional front, if you will, until either you can find a flank, right, and then open up a new box, or penetrate, create a flank, or just eliminate the threat altogether. And if you can't do any of those, then you're just stuck sitting there fighting positionally, right? And this is all, you've got to think about this in terms of like unmarked, non-unit designated unit markers when I'm explaining this, because people will always be like, well, at this level, you can still do maneuver. I'm like, okay, I got it, man. But I'm talking abstract, big picture right now. Conceptually, you can always, when you think about, like, if we're talking a division, sure, the platoons are probably still doing maneuver because they have space to do it. But like big picture, stepping back, watching the fight, that doesn't exist, right? So that I think is just a good way to think about it. And then when I read Zaluzhny's article, it was funny because I was like, I feel like you read my articles, because there was very much like there was a couple times I almost felt like he was plagiarizing me without giving me credit, and I was like, bro, you could have at least mentioned my name, or my article in your article, but I'll let that slide. So anyway, I think I hit every portion of the question you asked. Did I miss anything?
It's just you laid out several really interesting points. Just to pick on some of them. First of all, and of course we both know, and others also, that nothing is new in military sciences, and what you just talked about, actually the transition or the entropy of maneuver has already been detailed described by Clausewitz. Of course, we have to name names here. The culmination point of victory, but also there is a culmination point to maneuver as well. So that's somehow relates to the very character and nature of war, and the nature is, of course, unchanged. But the other thing, what struck me probably more interesting, is that the allure or the temptation of maneuver in military sciences, military planning, what you just talked about. And that's very interesting, actually, the point that whenever something new is coming up, which is not necessarily suitable with the existing status quo thinking about warfare, it's usually put aside or shoved aside. At the same time, of course, attrition has always been here, and people should have always counted with it. But then if you really focus on maneuver, kind of the cost benefit to it is I think it's rather cognitive, because there is an allure or a temptation to maneuver and offensive. If you believe that you may achieve victory through maneuver, then you may attempt it. Whereas, or in contrast to that, if you understand that the real nature of war is attritional, then actually the cost-benefit calculus is much different than just counting on surprise, major offensive maneuvers, and, count on victory. And then at the end of the day, what we see nowadays is that war, unfortunately, is still a technical sport when the input correlates with the output. So Also, people often recall the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where the drones started to change everything. But actually, if you look at the size of the armies which fought this battle, and the resources and the technology which went into that war, actually it was rather asymmetrical. So drone warfare itself, of course, it emerged. Of course, it had some decisive effects. But at the end of the day, with the input-output equation, there was a huge asymmetry between the sides. And then where it leads us is really to understand, and probably the war in Ukraine helps us immensely, unfortunately, to understand the real nature of war, is that it is attritional and it's taking a whole lot of costs from the societies which are involved, the states which are involved, and the industry which is involved, or the industries which are involved. And then this is something which should really upend or upset the current planning schemes, because I think it was David Kilcullen who said that the Ukrainians are fighting this war with their third army, and the Russians are fighting this war with their fifth army. So under no circumstances are these exactly the people who started it. And that kind of approach, I think it's very far from the usual European mindset. How to mobilize national economy, how to create reserves, how to plan with attrition, how to plan with ABC rotation, how you can actually plan for ABC rotation with your officer cadre, which is something of a huge challenge for armed forces which have to live off of an increasingly competitive market. So these are things which are probably coming closer, and kind of, on one hand, they are kind of shoving away this allure of war or allure of offensive and maneuver, because they are showing the real cost of actually war initiation or initiating wars. At the same time, they are increasingly scary, because you have to consider at least changing age-old premises and kind of baseline assumptions about how those current or future wars might be fought. So lots of lessons learned for political elites, for militaries themselves, and defense industry. I stop here.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things, I'm going to go backwards, but I was taking notes while you're talking, so I'm going to work backwards through my notes. Active defense. I think when we had active defense, that was us being the U.S. and then NATO, acknowledging the fact that, war with the Warsaw Pact, with, the Soviet Russia, would be exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine, right? But we couldn't have that, right? We didn't want to acknowledge the fact that it was going to be this long, hard slog. So we went and, totally threw that out, redid everything. We took lessons from, Israel's wars, and we're like, oh, look what Israel's doing. We can do that. And, we developed air land battle and replaced it. And that's really what set this whole maneuver. We can do things better, quicker, faster, than the adversary. And that really got us going down this path. And it was like this denial of reality that emerged, because Depew, he was in charge of TRADOC, training and doctrine command. He stood up training and doctrine command, developed active defense, put it out there, and it was based off his very, I would say, realist interpretation of experience, both in the Second World War, where he was, I think, a battalion commander in Division G3 for the 1st Infantry Division, operations officer G3, and then, I forget exactly, he's division commander during the Vietnam War, right? So he comes out of those experiences with a very realistic interpretation of how wars are won and lost. And then that drove the development of active defense, which was very much defensive, very much, positional, very much like you're going to have to absorb massive amounts of loss. You're also going to have to incur massive amounts of loss. And so that's why it's called active defense instead of passive defense, I guess, You're actually trying to wear down the opponent, because you understand that resources are really where wars are won and lost. And so, I think the war in Ukraine really shows that point. The other interesting part, and I've had this conversation with folks before when I was in Iraq the last time, is I had an Australian officer I used to always talk theoretical stuff with, and it was always enjoyable. And we talked about that. The war you go, or the army you go to war with, is never, almost never, especially in big wars, the army you finish with. It's probably not even remotely close. And like you said, you burn through your second army, your third army, depending on how long the war goes or how you're fighting. You may be your fifth army. You may be pulling prisoners out and helping you fight the war with prisoners, right? And so that's something when we think about how doctrine and concepts and ideas that we, develop in, Europe and the U.S. need to reflect reality, because if they don't, you're going to have this really boutique idea for this really boutique army that may only exist for a year, and then what, right? And the other part of that too is, if you find yourself in that sort of conflict, you need to have something, a way of fighting that is relatively simple for all these new people that you're going to be pulling in, rapidly training, rapidly sending out to the front, and then having them fight, right? And so you have to have ways of fighting, ways of warfare that are simple for those people. And then, your point on officers, I think, is really useful too, because, in that environment, in that scenario, how do we not protect the officers for the sake of protecting officers, but how do we protect officers to grow those additional armies, right? You need those officers to be the seeds that you use to plant, to grow that next army that's going to come along, to train back at, whatever training installation you may have, to lead that based off their experience on the front. And so there's probably also got to be, when we think about, force generation as it relates to big wars, officer rotations, what's the officer timeline? I would say the same as the U.S. Army veteran. Non-commissioned officers are a big part of how we do things, and I would think you would have to do something similar for your mid to senior level non-commissioned officers. You pull them out; they're going to be the training cadres that you send to your, your basic trainings and your advanced individual training, where you teach people their actual job. And so that rotation has to get figured out too, and that should be something that you shouldn't stumble into once you find yourself in a conflict like this, but something that's on the shelf that you've already worked through and have a basic, framework for how to do that. And I don't know that a lot of people are doing that and thinking that way. The other part of all of this, when we talk about, ways of fighting, I think it's important to remember too that we have to link, battles can't exist in the absence of the political decisions they're trying to achieve, right? To go back to Clausewitz, right? And so we have to make sure that the way that we're fighting is geared not towards something that sounds cool and looks great, but to generating military decisions that generate political decisions, right? Military outcomes on the battlefield should force political leaders to then look and say, oh, now what do I do, right? And it should do so in a way that causes them to be like, oh, man, do I keep fighting? Do I quit? Do I try and find other people to help me keep fighting? Right? It shouldn't just be fighting to not get to that decision point for political leaders, right? And so this is why I think attritional warfare actually has more relevance than what people give it credit to. Fighting, some sort of battle that then causes, because again, if we think about like what causes people to freak out, it's not, oh man, we just got surrounded and I surrender, and now I get to go be, a prisoner somewhere in Europe with, this European country or the U.S. they're all gonna treat me well, right? That really doesn't do much. But if you go out and destroy an army, that's something that makes people take pause and be like, what? Wait, I need to reevaluate the policy here. Is this worth continuing? I just lost, I'm picking a random number, 10,000 people in this massive battle in this city. Should I continue? Can I continue? Do I have the resources to continue? And so I think that's where, a lot of the contextual power of this idea of attrition gets lost too. Like, we have to be fighting in ways that fuel military outcomes that generate significant political decisions. And loss of equipment, loss of people, those things make political leaders say, whoa, wait a second, right? I mean, hell, you look back at like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for the United States. That was a huge consideration. That's a huge reason that we went in the way that we went into each of those conflicts. We went in very small numbers of people. Even the invasion of Iraq was like 190,000 people. And we quickly found that, yeah, that'll help. Like with our military, we could, quickly defeat the Iraqi military. But then we didn't have enough people to do what was required afterwards. And we didn't have the number of people because we were afraid of the political blowback at home if we had high casualties, right? Same thing in Afghanistan. Bin Laden escapes through the mountains because we just didn't have the people to seal the borders, right? And this is one of the things that gets lost in this whole conversation too, especially as we think about drones in the future. Like there are undeniable things that have to be done in war and warfare that drones simply can't do, right? Take, retake, and hold territory, sealed borders, right? It takes people on the ground to do that. Maybe someday we'll develop a robot that can do that, but for the time being, we don't have that robot. And so we need to still be thinking about that as it relates to the application of humans on the battlefield. But to get back to the point on forcing political decisions, this is the other part I think that also gets overlooked, right? When folks come in and did when Russia, Ukraine was getting ready to go, and everybody seemed surprised, which blew my mind because I'm like, if you were reading, if you just understand the history of those two countries and understand Putin's outlook on Ukraine itself, like you should not have been surprised. They already invaded in 2014. For me, and if you go back and read anything I wrote on that part of the conflict, I always said Russia was coming back, right? Russia wasn't done, right? And so I was not surprised. And then if you watched everything that was going on leading up to February 2022, Russia was gradually placing forces all along the border. And they'd be like, oh, we've built this national training center in Belarus. I'm like, sure you did. It was a staging base. It wasn't a national training. You may have been doing training there, but it was a staging base, right? And then, Russia invades and everybody's like, oh my God, I'm so surprised. Well, you should not have been surprised. But all of that to say, if you go back to Friedman and his comment on what's good strategy, it's power generation, right? And also part of that he also mentions is coalition formation. And so when you do the initial outlook on what each side brings to bear, I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say Russia's economy is on the verge of collapse, right? Russia's military is on the verge of collapse. It can't do all these things. And they just look at it in this very, stovepiped outlook of not thinking about that idea of power generation and coalition formation, right? And so this is where if you go back and read, what's his name, Dahl, I forget his first name, but he wrote a paper in like 1956, The Concept of Power. One of the basic ideas in this thing, right? So he's the guy that came up with the idea that power is A's ability to make B do something it wouldn't otherwise do. One of the key elements of power, though, is bases of power. And some of those bases of power are latent and or not yet formed, right? And so you go out and this goes back to Friedman, power generation, right? Coalition formation is how you offset those like known deficiencies or unknown deficiencies that you encounter once you start doing whatever thing it is you're going to do. And so this is another thing where folks are like, oh my God, the North Koreans are helping, right? I just saw yesterday that like 30,000 more North Koreans are about to be deployed to help Russia fight. And so you have to look at it through that lens and understand that, like, even though your initial assessment of just Russia may say this and they can do X over a certain amount of time, they also know that. And they're also looking for ways to offset that shortcoming. And so regardless of that, or I guess considering that, you have to think that no war that you're going to go into is going to be short, quick, and decisive. Because each side is trying to win. First, they're trying to survive. Second, they're trying to win, right? And so trying to win means generating more power, building coalitions, even if it's not a formal coalition or you don't actually, it's not publicly acknowledged that it's a coalition. And so those things contribute to this. And it's something that we often overlook when we go in and do initial, net assessments of each side going into a conflict. It's just like Ukraine, right? Everybody's like, oh, Ukraine's going to collapse within, pick your random number. There was several different numbers thrown out, but Ukraine didn't collapse, and they quickly sought ways to generate power and form coalitions, whether formal or informal, right? And the U.S., thankfully, has been a large part of that the entire time. So those are some things. The other thing you mentioned, Nagorno-Karabakh, that's like one of my that one always gets me riled up, because we took really cool YouTube videos, right? And we took that as like, this is the future of war. And I think you're 100% correct, but I do have something to build on what you said about the situational relevance of how that war was fought and how that war ended. The other part of it is it was a small theater, right? This is the other part of this whole conversation that everybody always misses. The size of the theater matters. Azerbaijan could do what they did against Armenia the way that they did because they were fighting on a micro theater. I live in Texas. Like, Texas is as big as like half of Europe or whatever that, you know what I mean? And so when they talk about this war, I always think of things and contextualizing it with how does that fit with where I live in Texas, you know? And I'm like, man, I could drive from here to that, you know, the length of that battlefield in no time. That's not something significant. That's not something we need to be walking away from and saying, oh my God. Because if you do the analysis, right, the force structure, asymmetry, right? That was a huge part of the problem. Is one side was equipped to fight one way, the other was equipped to fight another way, and they were equipped to fight poorly in the mountains to begin with, right? Very mountainous area. So if you're fighting with a bunch of tanks and people running around, it's easy to get stuck and canalized and hard to move around, right? So you already had this absence of mobility, and then you inject something over the top to fire down on people that can't move very well. Of course you're going to win quickly and easily. And then we take that, we remove that context, but then we also don't look at the size of the theater and say, if we were to replicate that scenario, what would it take in terms of investment on our end to get a comparable force ratio of drones to, you know, land force, to get that, you know, to potentially get that asymmetry in some other fight, right? And I don't have the numbers. I don't know what the numbers would be, but it would be significant, right? For like the U.S. Army to build a force that's comparable to that at scale, right? And then the question comes in, what about the cost of the munitions, right? You know, a basic artillery round is about $800, right? Just a normal HE round, high explosive round, sorry. The missiles that we're firing, like if you just say, we're going to have drones with Hellfires on them, I don't remember the cost of a Hellfire, but it's a lot. It is significantly more than an artillery round, right? And so is that something you can even do from an economic standpoint, is generate this force that you're talking about to do the things you do? And I would say the other part of that is, do you have the industrial base to do that? Again, I was at the, one of my last deployment to Iraq, I worked in the J5, the plan section, joint plan section of the Land Component Command during the fight against the Islamic State. And I caught the last couple months of the Battle of Mosul. And during that, we had run out of precision-guided munitions, right? Because PGMs are the huge thing that ties all of this new way of thinking together. We'd run out, and this is all open source. You can look it up. It's all out there. But when you think about it, so we had the Battle of Mosul going on. You had Raqqa, Aleppo, Kobani, all these sieges going on in Syria. And then you had Afghanistan, where we were playing whack-a-mole with the PGM going on still. And then in the Philippines, we had the Battle of Marawi going on essentially at the same time, which was essentially the same thing that you saw in Mosul, the same type of fighting, the same approach, right? And so you had whatever the number is, let's say 5 big battles in urban areas, all PGM-laden approaches, and we ran out. And there was a point during all this when we were, like, I was in these meetings every morning with the commander, and it was an update every morning from the J4, the logistics guy, telling the commander where the boat in the ocean was, bringing the next batch of PGMs to theater. Right, it was a daily update, like the boats in the middle of the Atlantic, sir. The boats, you know, and so when we think about like scaling Nagorno-Karabakh-esque warfare, something we want to do, you have to ask those questions. Can we do it? Is it economical? It goes back to strategy, right? Do we have the means to accomplish the ways that we want to accomplish? The answer is no. You either need to go out and find the means, right? Retool how you do defense procurement, right? What your industrial base looks like, where you need to come up with a different way to approach warfare. And you shouldn't bankrupt yourself with a super sexy way of fighting just because it's super sexy, right? It's the same thing like managing your own budget in your house. You can go out and buy all the greatest stuff in the world. You can go into debt. You can max out your credit cards. You can mortgage your house to get a cool new thing. But like, is it worth it? These are the questions that I think are unanswered. And I don't think now if there's some big revolution in how we generate munitions that are exactly the same or close, that are significantly cheaper, okay. And that's probably a place and I don't know because I don't work in the defense industry, but that's something we probably need to be thinking about.
I just want to add one idea to that, and exactly it's about affordability. So I was really surprised to participate at the European Defense Fund discussion. It was also open source, and everyone was actually talking about affordable mass munitions. And because I have been a defense planner since 2 decades, actually, I'm relatively familiar with most of the kind of NATO defense planning frameworks and ideas, but affordable mass munition is something which has really only re-emerged during the last 2-3 years. So we might understand this as a kind of a systemic reaction to address affordability and the economy of scale. On the other hand, it's also not solving the problem in itself. And I think that the other interesting kind of direction of the conversation is that, at least from the defense industrial side, is that an increasing number of small, medium enterprises are trying to enter the market of drones, unmanned systems. And of course, they are focusing on the most, appealing products, actually. And this is all about loitering munition and FPVs. But what is very interesting that the industry is not always capturing that we are talking about a system, a layered, unmanned system. And then again, integrating sensors and effectors within this system is even more complicated, and cost-intensive than people understand. And so my kind of impression, and it might be right or wrong, is that we may end up with a lot of SMEs actually specializing in FPVs, and some of them are, of course, really good, and most of them are tested in the appropriate environments. But then we are missing the forest from the wood, and then don't realize that actually you have to have the big, super expensive one, which is relaying 5G signals to the smaller ones. And actually, then it's also a discussion of scale, which you have mentioned yourself. Coming from a Central European country of 10 million people, of course, the Hungarian Defense Forces is transforming itself. It's robust and it's developing, but it's 3 brigades. So actually, if you really understand the depth and the cost of waging a kind of drone warfare, which everyone keeps imagining around, then very early you hit a practical ceiling of achievability. It's impossible to achieve for one country. You have to scale it up. You have to create those alliances which you talked about, and actually scale up economy, but also scale up force generation and force integration. And I think that one of the major lessons from this entire drone warfare is exactly that it's not the FPVs, it's all the other drones behind, and all the kind of, very interesting for me at least, the critical importance of learning data. How actually you teach your artificial intelligence or machine learning tools to recognize signals and then make decisions or inform decisions on that basis. And this learning data, actually, you can either generate it real time, in which case you are fighting a war, and that's a bad news. And the other one is that you generate it in a synthetic environment. But what we found is actually the value of the learning data generated in a synthetic environment is suboptimal to the learning data which is generated in real environments. So there's just one more example to talk about the increasing complexity of all of it, which is kind of contrary to the popular belief. It's not actually lowering the threshold of kind of accessing new types of weapon systems and acquiring new capabilities for smaller states and terrorist groups and stuff like that. It's all about increasing thresholds in order to really successfully wage, if needed, a sustained and complex war. So affordability, economies of scale, alliances, I think these are all, of course, ideas which belong together. You have to tackle them together. And I'm trying to frame what you just said about attrition. So this re-emerging understanding on the critical centrality of attrition should remind us all to actually think more on alliances, economies of scale, and affordability, because it's all about an increasingly complex and cost-intensive warfare, what we are looking at in the years to come and unfolding around us.
Yeah, I think the other part of this, folks like to bandy about Clausewitz, right? You can't sound smart if you don't mention Clausewitz. And so a lot of folks will always be the nature of war, right? And it never changes. And one of the fundamental ideas that Clausewitz puts forward is that it's a human endeavor, right? But then they talk about drones absent of war being a human endeavor. And so I think it's important when you talk about systems, everything is a system, everything is interrelated, right? And so when we think about human endeavor and drones, you have to also think about what does a human do? So drones inevitably attack from or inherently attack from above, right? And so when you're attacked from above, the human response is to go to safety. Go underground, you hide, you go into a city, you hide in a building, right? And so while drones, you may kill a couple people, in this drone attack. If you have a big drone attack, you may, eliminate several people. I don't know what the number is, right? This is all a thought experiment right now at this point. But the undeniable thing here is that humans will go hide and try and survive, because that's the first rule of war, right? The first rule of war is survive. And the first rule of being a human is survive. And so we talk about drones in the absence of the human's survival instinct, and that drones will accomplish all these things. Look at FPVs. They're precise. They're precisely eliminating this and that, right? But humans will go hide. And I published a report with CG, a Canadian think tank, I think it was late last year, on this idea. And it was, I talked about attacks from above and the human response, and how what you're actually going to see, drones aren't going to accelerate war and win wars quickly. The more that you attack from above and then you don't have the requisite force to come in together with it, again, going back to your point on systems, right? You have to have the air component and the land component, because it's a system, right? And if you don't have that land force to come in behind the drones or alongside the drones that are attacking from above, which is causing your opponent to then disperse, hide, and take up survival locations, and you don't have that land force, and you just keep thinking drones are going to be the answer, while you may be precise, you're going to be ineffective, right? Ineffective in generating the military outcomes that fuel the political decisions needed to change the direction of a war in your favor. And so if we think about this, we have to think about it in relation to that system, that symbiotic relationship that has to exist between attacking from above and following in with land force, or following in with land force, flushing things out and attacking from above. But we have to keep those things intertwined. And it's so ironic, because what am I talking about? Oh, that's combined arms theory, right? You're using combined arms. That's been a part of military thinking forever, right? But the tech bros and all the futurists haven't run enough, military history and military theory to understand that you can't have one without the other, right? And so this is where I think we really have to be careful, because I'm all for drones. I'm not a drone hater whatsoever. I think they're terrific, and they are a valuable addition to combined arms thinking, right? and joint, right? I think joint combined arms, it's the same thing. If you're thinking joint warfare, oh, you're not talking about the Air Force. I'm talking about things that come from the sky and do things on the ground or do things in the air, right? And so that context is often missing from this discussion about what drones can provide for the future. Because if you have that situation occurring where you're attacking with drones and you don't have the requisite land force to come in and take the next step, which is go into those hard to reach places that drones can't get to and clear out, eliminate the threat, whatever the case may be as it relates to your military goal, then you've got a situation where guess what's going to happen? Your war is actually going to get longer because you're fighting ineffectively. And so sometimes you have to spend more up front and win quicker than spend less, just focusing on the drone aspect, achieving less, which will then draw out the duration of the conflict. And this is part of this conversation I think that's also missing is that relationship between, is what it is I'm trying to do generating the outcome I need, yes or no? If no, what is that doing to the duration of the conflict? It's probably making it longer, making it more expensive, making it a bigger drain on everybody, your own society, the international community, all those things, as opposed to what would happen if we just went in hard and fast with this combined arms element, right? The drones from the top, the land force coming in and fighting and winning quickly. It may require more upfront in terms of, committing forces, but it's going to get this thing over quicker, potentially, right? Again, these are all theoreticals that you don't actually know until you get in war, and that's the interesting thing about war is you can never rerun it, like rewind it, change the force structure and the weapons, and then play it again and see what the outcome is, and see if your theory is correct. And this is one of the things I had in Mosul. After Mosul had ended, I was in the J5 shop talking with a British Army officer, and we were talking about the precision munition sink because I've written a bunch of stuff about the precision paradox, which is essentially just because it's precise doesn't mean that, and just because it's accurate doesn't mean that you're actually generating any outcome that's helpful, outside of marginally, destroying a few things and killing a few people. And so we were going back and forth, and it was very much like, I don't know if you've seen Spinal Tap, but the scene where the guitar player is talking with Rob Reiner about the amp going up to 11, and Rob Reiner's like, why don't you just make 10 louder? It was very much when him and I were having this conversation, I said, what would have happened had we just fought Mosul with, ballistic artillery and not used all these PGMs? Because the city was flattened either way, right? If we flatten the city with PGMs, wouldn't it have just been cheaper to flatten it with artillery and go in heavier and harder early on and potentially not had to kill the whole city to eliminate the Islamic State? And he's like, yeah, but we used PGMs. And it was like that obviated the discussion and any critique of the fight because, well, we were fighting more humanely and smarter. And I'm like, bro, the city's still flattened and we still killed thousands of people, civilian and Islamic State fighters. And that's the thing. I would love to have the ability to rewind that, change, all the PGMs to, normal artillery, run it again and see how the outcome would change. And this is where I think when we think about defense planning for the future, we do war games, and war games are really, really, I did a lot of war games when I worked at Army Futures Command. I worked on the Army Warfighting Concept for 2040, which still hasn't been published. And we did war games like once a quarter out at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And those are so flawed and so messed with by the people that control the organization that the outcome was always not realistic, right? And so I would love to see not what are those other things called? Not the war game, not the CPX exercise. I would love to see a simulation that you could go in and say, all right, we're going to do the battle muzzle. Let's put in this package of things and simulate it, right? Now let's change it, and let's change what we're putting in on our end to fight the fight. Run it again. Run that stuff. Or, when you're thinking about concept development and drone warfare, let's put this thing in the simulator, run it 1,000 times, and every, whatever number, or change the variables to see how things come out differently. And then you would have a far better model than going back to books like William Lynn's Maneuver Warfare Handbook and be like, no, we're doing maneuver because, these 3 people said it's great. And seeing how those simulations, what data it gives you, and then saying, okay, and again, all data is fallible, right? But it gives you something better than a war game that's been rigged to your favor to generate the outcomes you want so that you can go back and backbrief and say, yes, we need more HIMARS in the MDTF because MDTFs are the way that we're going to defeat China in a Taiwan scenario, right? When in actuality, that may not be the case. So when I think about this is one of the things that I have not seen it, and I think needs to be developed as some sort of simulation that you can just generate tons and tons and tons of data, change the variables, reference historical battles as the starting point, Mosul, Marawi, whatever the case may be, and then just generate the data, see what the data says, and then use that to help inform .mil PFP or .mil PFI analysis, as we look at how we're going to organize things for the future. So that's it. Back over to you.
Yeah, so actually I have very recently visited one of the companies here in Hungary, and they introduced a surprisingly mature constructive simulation effort, which have been able to actually simulate a population of almost 1 million people in a city, marshes, everything. And, it's really a great synthetic environment to embed these kind of ideas and bring it forward. I also wanted to comment on your idea on the problems of increasing inefficiency and how it's kind of inefficiency impacted by the changing operating environment and how it is also influencing strategies and future operations. But my great guilt is that I love listening to you. And therefore, I have been an awful, moderator and kind of didn't ask enough questions. So let's not use much more of your time and turn a little bit to understanding the extent and direction of change, if at all, in terms of military technologies, in terms of how actually kind of military planning, force profiles, future force designs are changing, are impacted by the evolving operating environment and new technologies. Is it over-reported? Of course, we have our opinion about this. Probably we agree. But we may also establish that there is indeed change ongoing. The character of warfare, if not changing decisively, it is certainly in transition. And so I'm asking that with a view to, of course, SMEs in defense industry who would be interested to hear the opinion of military thinker, a strategic thinker like you. So where's change taking place? What's the direction of it? What's the extent? Of course, as much as you can answer these questions. And then the last one would be, what would be your hint, your offer to small, medium enterprises if they want to understand how the capability value chain is changing? What are the force packages, which are becoming more important? What are the ones which may be losing their kind of centrality, if at all? There is a lot of discussion about the main battle tanks. Of course, we know that those are far-fetched, but also there are good lessons to be learned about it. It's not an easy set of questions, but you will handle it very well.
Hopefully I can get through it all. We got a big thunderstorm going, so if you hear crashes in the background, it's the thunderstorm. So change, I do think there is change going on, and it's part of the impact of drones. And the change is that this term, I hate the term, but it's the term being used, so I'm going to use it. And I've published a paper on this too. I actually went back and reread the paper about a month ago, and I was like, man, this paper's actually really good. Every now and then I'll read something I wrote, and I'm like, God, this sucks. But that one I was like, man, this is I really like. But the idea of the air ground littoral, right? So the space between the ground and, I don't know, pick your altitude, right? 10,000 feet or something, where traditionally it was just the realm of mortar rounds, artillery shells, and attack aviation, maybe some close air support in terms of whatever it is, F-18s and A-10s, right? Periodically as they came through. Well, now that space is becoming completely saturated with drones, right? And we don't currently have the technology to, I don't even like that phrase either. We don't have the warfighting capabilities or systems needed to effectively operate in that space. And so this is part of the rub where everybody, I think, thinks drones are the new hot thing, but it's just we haven't quite figured out the counter drone aspect of this, right? And so that's part of the reason the thoughts on drones are becoming such a big feature of what's changing. But I don't think that that's the part that's important. What we have to do, again, thinking about it, is a system and that combination between things that come in from above and the need for the land force. What's missing right now is we don't have adequate protection for the land force to operate the way that it's supposed to operate. And so for me, the changing OE really, and to get the last part of your other point, if I was a defense industry person, especially that small, medium space, I would be looking at how can I provide localized protection capability for land forces that allow them to move underneath and in this contested air-ground littoral where there's all these drones that can hit me precisely, right? And that, to me, is the underdeveloped part of this, and the part that when we think about the air-ground littoral, to me, that's really where the change in the operating environment is most tangible for most folks, but not clearly articulated. That's really what needs to be looked at. And so when we look at technologies that can enable, open up, facilitate the land force to still do the land force requirements, take ground, hold ground, defend against counterattacks, not culminate doing all that, seal boundaries, right? When we think about technological change, we need to think about it through that lens. How are we opening up the land force's ability to still do that, because it's still a requirement in this area, this air-ground littoral that's completely saturated with drones? And so when we think about military planning, that's also the consideration we need to think about, is how do we develop concepts that allow us to do that, to still fight with combined arms, because combined arms theory is not going away in any way that I can imagine, unless you play the nuke card, right? That's always like the get out of jail free card as well. What about nuclear weapons? Like, bro, we got to set that aside. Yeah, we got to set that aside to continue the conversation. That's always the like, oh, you win, right? Okay, you won. So when we think about that, we have to think about technology and how that technology that's missing right now, we can generate that technology and then incorporate that technology into military planning and strategy that allows us to still fight with combined arms, still fight jointly, if you want to use that word instead. And then I think inherent to all that is the coalition and alliance standpoint, right? It's always going to be part of this. And so when we think about force design, the U.S. Army in particular is moving. It's sold its soul in the name of the multi-domain task force, right? We've sold off all sorts of combat power over the past 2 years because we're essentially operating in a zero-sum game as it relates to force structure. We can generate new force structure, but it comes at a cost of existing force structure. And so, in 2024, the Army decided to get rid of a ton of stuff, land force-wise, MPs, military police, engineers, cavalry units, reconnaissance for the U.S., and a bunch of other stuff, right? And then this past year, back in April of 2025, the Department of Defense issued another transformation memorandum, and it further directed the gutting of land forces, and it did it under the language of, we're gonna be more high-minded about war and warfare, and so we got to get rid of legacy. Legacy is the term, legacy technology, and so we're going to get rid of legacy technology so that we can bring in all these new technologies that are going to get us ahead of the game, and it's going to integrate artificial intelligence and this and that. And it's like pixie dust you have to sprinkle in to sound, high-minded. Artificial intelligence, drones, machine learning, right? Even though like you're just using the words, but you have not anchored it on anything tangible. The other funny thing too about legacy, when we were in Paris, I don't remember. It was during the Q&A after I had talked. One of the people was like, "You just talked about continuities," and he said continuities as though it was a pejorative, right? And I'm like, continuities are continuities because they're continuities. They're important. As much as you want to, pretend like you're a futurist and you're high-minded, and you talk about how drones have obviated this and AI is going to get rid of the need to do that. At the end of the day, like, things are still going to continue the way that they've been for a long time because it's inherent to the way wars are fought and won and lost, And so when we think about all that, technology, military planning, force design, and really what small and medium industries and even large industries can contribute to that, it's remembering that the continuities, those aren't bad things. Continuity is not a bad word, right? Legacy systems, some of them probably might need replaced, but legacy systems as a concept, like the tank, again, and I fully acknowledge I'm biased because I was a tanker, but the tank will continue to have relevance, especially once you unlock that, how can I protect my force in the air, ground, littoral space? Because if you have gotten rid of your tanks and your opponent has not, and they've figured out how to protect themselves in the air, ground, littoral from those attacks from above via drones and all the things that you've sold off your land force for, guess what? When they got that protective bubble around their land force firing, and you've just got drones that can't penetrate through and nothing in between whatever it is that you have that they want, and they've got tanks and mechanized, infantry, mechanized forces and all these things rolling on the ground, you've left yourself completely exposed. And so, again, back to the point of system, everybody has to think of this in terms of systems and systems being layered within, on top of, inside one another. And you can't break apart one of those and just say, this is the thing, right? Because that's the other part of this. If you go back and look at the history of everything as it relates to war, technology has never been a silver bullet. It will never be a silver bullet, right? And if you go back to the early air power theorists of the early 20th century, right? You think about Duhay, you think about Billy Mitchell, some of these other people. It was always the bomber's going to get through, and it'll win wars quickly. And all we got to do is bomb cities and industrial bases, and the enemy will throw up their hands and give up, right? Well, that didn't work. That doesn't work, right? And it's the same thing with this fascination that we have with a lot of the emerging technology. Not even emerging. I mean, drones have been around for 100 years, right? Right. And so we just have to make sure that we're not getting caught up in the hype. And this is part of the reason my previous book, it's called Conflict Realism. We have to be conflict realists. We have to understand the realities of conflict and not be conflict hypists, right? Or put our thumb in our suspenders and be like, I'm a futurist, I'm high-minded and better than you because I think about the future. I think about the future too, you know what I mean? But I think about it through the lens of systems, realism, right? Reality, human nature, how humans are actually going to operate when they're attacked from above. They're not just going to stand there and say, hey, keep killing me. They're going to run and hide. And then that's automatically complicated what it was you thought was going to be simple. So I would offer that as the answer to, like the industry question too. Like we have to keep all that in mind. And a lot of industry folks, some have military experience, some don't. And for the folks that don't, I would say go talk to somebody grounded in continuities of war and legacy, understanding the legacies within war and warfare, to then, think about how you're going to frame the system that you're developing. Because otherwise, if you just go to talk to people that are saying, all we need is more drones and it's going to win the war quickly, you're going to develop the wrong system. And you're going to develop something. Again, this is the question. Are you trying to help militaries and states, or are you trying to make money, right? If you want to make money, just sell it as it's the game-winning, game-changing technology that will win wars quickly. you're trying to actually help militaries be effective, you need to buffer it based off those variables that I just mentioned. So that's the basic answer. The real change to me is that air, ground, littoral space. And this is something when I first heard this idea, I didn't like it. I still don't like the term because littoral implies water in my mind. But that space there, I think, is really what everybody is really talking about, but it doesn't have a vocabulary to talk about it in a meaningful way. And there's not a real good framework on it. Again, if you go look that up, you'll see only a handful of things written about it. One of the things is something I wrote. And I think that idea, that air, ground, littoral, is something we really need to focus on when we think about, okay, in the future, what do we need to account for that isn't really accounted for today? And then how can we, build out .mil PFP to support that new change in the environment? And to me, that's really what we need to do. And we need to have a clear language and concepts, right? Or strategy, if you want to use that word, for how to operate within that space, not independent of everything else, but how it fits as a system within warfare as a whole.
Yeah. During my time at NATO, we developed a framework for that. Maybe you also remember, because we talked about that in Paris, and that the future operating environment is going to be more congested. And that also talks about what you just mentioned: contested, commercialized, confused. So congestion and contestation in all domains is something what we have to take into account as we are building our forces. And of course, in defense of all the foresight people and futures people, I think doing futures is not about, and shouldn't be about, kind of fleeing away from the current existing institutional deficiencies. It's not a Wunderwaffe. It's not going to solve issues in itself, but it's really about bounded imagination. It's about practicing collaborative work together and imagining potential scenarios and futures, because it's still, I think, a huge problem for defense planners that decisions which are actually designing and then generating force designs and capabilities are made today in the current circumstances, whereas the result of this exercise, the capability value chain, is going to mature in a future operating environment which is already transitioned, shifted, changed. So it makes sense to look ahead, but I agree that we shouldn't really kind of overemphasize technology without understanding the entire context. And of course, I should finish it now, but one more question. Also, Zaluzhnyi's article about the maneuver and attrition, actually, his solution, and he's pretty conditional about it in this article, but his solution is that maybe electronic warfare might be something, the emergence of some new doctrine, technology, or whatever, which may kind of create a new balance between, of course, maneuvers and fires. So, and because you talked about this idea for SMEs to prepare consciously for that new kind of operating environment, congested and contested with drones, and of course focus more on active and passive measures, multispectral camouflage, and so on. So actually, this discussion also begs the question: what do you think about electronic warfare and its impact on maneuvers and fires? And this will be really my last question.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you can essentially cut free from anything. If you're at that point, cut free from anything that's fueled by cyber electronic. I don't know what the right word is I'm looking for. That's networked, right? And you can still fight at the end of the day. It's going to be harder and slower, but you can still fight on the ground with forces moving, right? People can still move independent of being able to talk on a radio, talk via, digital signals. And so that's that's another reason I think we can't sell off the land force component of this, the actual people on the ground who can still go face to face and get orders, right? And still evacuate people by picking them up and carrying them, that we can't overlook as it relates to all this. Because yes, we do need to insulate ourselves. And this is one of the big things when I was working on the Army warfighting concept for 2040 was the DDIL, denied, interrupted, I forget the whole acronym, but it was being insulated against electronic attack. And that was one of the things that we were really working on. But again, going back to the system, we didn't then say, okay, and what if we're not able to still communicate because the electronic environment, the electronic attack from the adversary prohibits that? You know, and we had changed the force structure in this scenario that we were wargaming to where we had like almost no land force, right? What do you do then? You don't do anything. You can't do anything. Then you're just prone and prostrate, you know, waiting to get attacked. And so I think that the electronic warfare aspect, again, lends itself to more investment, not less, in a land force that's capable of operating in an environment where they can't communicate, right? And that requires human beings that can still talk face to face. It will make things extremely slow compared to what it is today. Absolutely. You know, we're stepping back in time 100 years essentially. But if you don't have that capability and you're in a war, right, then you're losing. And so I think that that's the big caution when we think about electronic warfare is let's play through the scenarios. What if we can't communicate? What if we don't have this and that to help enable all these things? Well, we need artillery that can still be fired without, you know, whatever it's called now, but the FATADS box communicating through the command post. You still need to be able to get artillery firing. You probably still need rockets. I have no idea how HIMARS and GIMLRs and all that stuff works, but you still need to be able to fire those absent of the digital stuff coming in. The other part of that is you have to also appreciate the fact that then you're probably not going to be nearly as precise in terms of precision guided munitions, right? Then MLRS may quickly become an area fire weapon again, as opposed to a very discrete point fire weapon. And so I think that to me, when I think about electronic warfare and its utility in the future, it's 100% we need to be thinking through how to weaponize it so that we can destroy the networks of other people and get inside all their networked systems. But then also what happens to us if we get shut down? That's the part I think of all this when I think about, in particular, U.S. Military doctrine is we never say, it's always written as though we have the higher ground, we have the best position, we have nothing that's interrupted our ability to operate the way that we want to operate, and everything's geared toward best case scenario. And electronic warfare is really one of those things where, a force that's operating on purpose will still go operate on purpose, right? And so a force that doesn't have a purpose may just give up, right? And so that's why we really have to consider again, people like to feel proud and pat themselves on the back and quote Clausewitz about the unchanging nature of war and how war is a human endeavor and, bound up in fog, friction, and chance. But like they rarely actually acknowledge the human element of that. And I think that when I think about electronic warfare, that's really what jumps out at me.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are already 90 minutes, much more than planned. But thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. And of course, I would love to continue talking about Clausewitz. Actually, in the Hungarian Military Sciences University, you cannot get a summa cum laude without reading Clausewitz in German. And making a flawless exam from it. Alternatively, War and Peace from Tolstoy could also be read in Russian, but then it was 20 years ago, and that amounted to the same kind of achievement, because our teacher in military sciences told us that actually if you want to become a defense policy expert, you have to understand war, but because you will be civilians during your entire life, you have to understand the cruelty and the true nature of war in order to become a true leader, civilian leader literature for the military colleagues you are going to work with. And for that, either you have to read Clausewitz in German or Tolstoy in Russian, because that's what really portraying the true nature of war. But in any case.
Yeah, Tolstoy, War and Peace. Tolstoy is one of my favorite authors, and then War and Peace I've read a couple times, and it's always one of those like, hey, this is going to take me. I fully understand it's going to take me a year to get through this again, but I'm going to do it. And I've read it probably 3 times, and I absolutely love that book. It's so rich, and the storytelling and all the different characters, and you get caught up in certain people's story, and you're like, oh man, it's so good. But that I would say, most Americans, we only speak one language and can only read one language, and it's unfortunate because we miss out on some of the rich tapestry and nuance that we don't get when we read the Peter Paret. And I'm pointing to my bookshelf, like you can see it, the Peter Paret and Michael Howard version of translation of war, on war. And when I was in SAMS, I had a CGSC in SAMS, a German officer and German general staff guy was in my class, and he used to always say, yeah, this version of, because he had to read that version of On War for CGSC and SAMS, and he's like, and you think that's tough? You should read it in the native German, because it's written in a version of German that Germans don't speak as much or whatever. That it's a little different than what they do now. And he's like, it's almost impossible to get through. And I'm German, and I was like, well, it's hard enough to read in English. So tip of the cap to you guys, But anyway, terrific opportunity. I love it. It's been great. I could probably talk another 90 minutes, but you probably got stuff to do, and so do I. So I'm happy to come back down the road if you want.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Amos. És akkor ezzel befejeztük beszélgetésünket. Nagyon köszönjük, hogy velünk tartottak. Szeretnénk többször folytatni az angol nyelvű podcastokat, interjúkat, úgyhogy reméljük, hogy támogatnak minket azzal, hogy továbbra is követik a VIKI honlapját és a VIKI eseményeit, és ezek között az angol nyelvű adásainkat. Viszontlátásra!